Hello everyone, this is Jason Merkel with Horizon Hobby, and we're here today to talk about replacing a servo on a HobbyZone AeroScout S trainer aircraft. So this particular airplane was crashed pretty hard during our video shoot when we hit a football goalpost. And so generally speaking, you won't damage servos in most crashes, but on occasion you will. In this particular instance, it hit very, very hard on the nose, and because of the nose wheel being relatively large and kind of out in front, we did actually damage the gears in the rudder servo. And I'm going to show you how to diagnose that. But first and foremost, I'll explain that the airplane is powered on. I do have the throttle cut or the motor disarm switch in the disarm position to make sure the motor and the propeller do not run. Generally speaking, it's not a bad idea to just remove the propeller altogether whenever you're working around the airplane with it powered on. But I do have it all connected and powered up. I'm going to remove the hatch here, and you guys actually might hear in the background some buzzing coming from one of the servos, and that usually is an indication that you've got a bad servo. So I'm going to take the battery out. I'm going to leave it plugged in so I can show you the difference between a servo that's operating correctly and one that's not. So you guys will see here that the elevator servo is on the right side of the airplane, the rudder servo is on the left side of the airplane. When I move the elevator stick, and by the way, I've gone to the experienced flight mode with the switch on the top left shoulder all the way towards me, so that way there's no safe technology activated right now, because that would kind of get in the way of showing this to you. But when I move the elevator stick, you can see the servo's moving just fine, moving back and forth as it normally should. When I move the rudder stick, however, you can see the rudder servo, it's kind of bouncing back and forth, but it's not fully moving in any direction. So the rudder is not moving correctly, nor is the nose wheel steering moving correctly. And you can probably hear a little bit of that sound of the servo gears or the servo itself trying to move but not being able to move. Oh, and there you can really hear it having a hard time there. So I've diagnosed now that I've got a bad rudder servo. So the first thing I'm going to do, just to be safe, I'm going to unplug the battery from the airplane, turn the controller off, the transmitter off. And now I'm going to work on replacing the servo. Now, you can buy replacement servos for this aircraft separately. So in this case, we've got a replacement servo here that we got separately. You can sometimes replace the gears within a servo, but I will say I've done this a number of times and I don't really recommend it. It's not a fun process to take the servo apart, remove all these little plastic gears, get them back in there and get it back together and make sure it works reliably again. It's better in this case just to buy an entire new servo and to replace the entire servo. So I will need a screwdriver with a relatively small Phillips tip here to unscrew the screw that's holding the servo arm on, and then also to remove the servo altogether. So first I'm going to start by removing the screw that is securing the servo arm onto the servo. Then I'll be very careful to not lose this very small screw here that secures that and set that off to the side. Then I'm going to pop my servo arm off of my servo and kind of push it off to the side so it's a little bit out of the way. And now I'm going to remove these two screws that are securing the servo into place. And then I'm going to remove the servo from the airplane after I unplug it from the receiver. So let's remove. Now the servo is currently connected to the receiver, which is underneath the wing, kind of mounted in the top of the fuselage here. And so what I need to do is remove the wire lead that is plugged into the rudder channel in this case. So on Spectrum receivers like this one that's installed in the aircraft, channel 1 is usually throttle, channel 2 is aileron, channel 3 is the elevator, and channel 4 is the rudder. So I do need to go ahead and unplug that channel 4 here. You have to be careful, there's not a lot of clearance to get that plug out, but you can do it. You can see I'm wiggling the servo because that was the right one. And now I'm going to go back to the servo and lift up on it and kind of help fish the wire down through the opening. Use the screwdriver to help push it through the rest of the way. There we go. And there we go. I've now removed the servo completely from the airplane. And so this servo, again, you could potentially repair it by replacing the gears, but I don't recommend doing that. I would just say at this point, you could probably discard that servo and use just the new one instead. So in this case, we've got the new servo to install. We need to make sure that the output shaft here with the white plastic gear is oriented towards the rear of the aircraft, just like the original one was that we're removing. One of the hardest parts of this replacing the servo is going to be fishing this wire lead through the fuselage and back up into that receiver. So we need to do that carefully. So first we slide it into the hole where the servo mounts. Then there's an opening right behind that in the plywood tray. So I'm going to pull the wire lead up through there first. I'm going to go ahead and set the servo down into its opening, so it's kind of in place loosely. Now I'm going to take this wire lead and I need to fish this up through the fuselage to the receiver. So I need to go back in here and kind of eyeball it. And I can tell you it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a set of hemostats available, or even some small but long needle nose pliers if you've got them, or tweezers. In this case, I'm going to try and do it without. There we go. Now sometimes servo wire leads are a different color, and don't be alarmed by that. Basically, lighter colors usually mean it's the signal wire. Red wire is always positive, it's always in the middle, and then the negative wire is usually a black or a dark brown color. In this case, if you plug the servo in backwards into the receiver because it's center positive, it shouldn't do any damage to the servo or the receiver. That said, you still want to make sure you have it plugged in the correct orientation to make sure the servo operates correctly. So in this case, I need to have the signal wire, or this orange wire, or the original servo had a white wire. I need to have that pointing up towards the top of the receiver, just like the other ones that are already plugged in. So I need to carefully plug this back into channel 4. And again, it takes a little bit of work to get this in there just right. Okay, so I've got it back into the channel 4 slot, and you can see I've pressed it all the way in to make sure that it's got a positive, solid connection. And now my servo is connected properly to my rudder channel. And then I'm going to use those larger silver screws and secure the servo in the plywood tray. Now my servo is secured, but before I install the servo arm, and this is very, very important, not all servos have exactly the same neutral position or spline, which is the basic teeth on the outside of the output gear. The spline and the center of the servo may not match exactly the servo that you're replacing. So the reason this is important is because we need to put the servo arm back on as close to the neutral position as possible, and then also we may need to mechanically adjust the center position of the rudder and the nose wheel before we go and fly again. So the first step is I'm going to turn my transmitter, my controller, back on, and there are these small trim levers, and in this case I'm going to move the rudder trim lever to make sure that it's in the center position. And if you listen carefully, you're going to hear beeps. And when it's in the middle position, it's a little bit louder beep. So that's the center position. So now that I have that centered, I'm going to make sure that my motor disarm switches to the front, so that way I'm safe and I'm not going to have the propeller spin. I'm also going to stay in the experienced mode. And now I'm going to put my receiver, or plug my battery back into the airplane. I'm not going to install it in the airplane just to keep it out of the way for us to see. Now, you do have to sometimes hold the airplane level to initialize the receiver properly, so I'll do that. So now everything is initialized properly. I've got my motor disarm on, so I can't turn my throttle on and my propeller won't run, and I have now control of the elevator servo. The rudder servo, I'm going to make sure it's working, and now that I've centered the trim here, I can actually go back to the arm that needs to be installed on the servo. And I want this to be basically perpendicular to the servo, as close to perpendicular as possible. Now you can see I can install it in this position, so it's close to perpendicular. I can also install it slightly off of perpendicular, or a lot off of perpendicular if I'm not careful. So I need to make sure that the orientation of that arm is as close to perpendicular to the servo case as possible. Now you may have to use a hand to hold down the arm because there is some pressure on it due to the push rods going to the rudder and to the nose wheel. So I'm holding it down relatively square. Hopefully you guys can see that there. And now I'm going to install the small screw to secure that arm in place. This part, not so easy. You have to be careful to not drop the screw down inside the airplane. If you have a magnetic tip screwdriver, that actually would be a big help. In this case I don't, so I'll just have to carefully align everything to make sure the arm stays in place and that I get that screw in there okay. Tighten that screw down carefully without stripping the gears. And now you'll notice that once I've gotten everything tightened up, the servo arm is not exactly square. I think it's a little bit off from where it was originally. So what I'm going to do now is mechanically adjust the rudder and the nose wheel so they're straight. This is now the neutral position of the rudder servo. This is now the neutral position for the rudder channel. So I want my rudder and my nose wheel to be as straight as possible in that position. Now I can adjust it electronically with the trims later on, but I'm just making sure everything is mechanically centered at this point. So if you notice here, there's push rods going to the servo arm, and they have little Phillips screws that are basically on top of what we call an easy connector. If you loosen these screws, it'll allow you to move that push rod back and forth. In this case, if you look closely at the rudder, you'll see that it's not straight. So I'm going to mechanically adjust it to the center position by loosening that screw, holding it in the center position, then tightening that screw back down on the easy connector. So I'm going to loosen that screw. I'm not going to go super loose. I'm going to keep maybe just a little bit of pressure on there so it might help hold it into place. And then I'm going to look at the rudder and make sure that it's as close to straight as possible relative to the fin and fuselage. Then I'm going to go back here and tighten that easy connector screw. I'm going to double check my center. Looks good, and I'm going to go back here and use my hand to help hold the push rod and servo arm so I don't strip the gears, and tighten that down all the way. Make sure that's nice and solid there. So that's the first step. So now my rudder is center in my neutral position, and now I need to look at my nose wheel. And a lot of times you kind of just have to eyeball this based on maybe this center seam here on the fuselage. You can see if the nose wheel is twisted one way or the other. And I'm going to go back to the easy connector, and similar to what I did on the rudder, I'm going to straighten that out and make sure that it's as close to neutral as possible. Just a little, so I've got a little bit of pressure on that push rod still. I'm going to flip the fuselage over. I'm going to kind of eyeball this straight as possible. There's going to be a little bit of slop. It does not have to be perfectly straight, just as close to straight as you can get. Should help it stay straight during takeoff and landing and taxiing. Now that I've got that close, I'm going to go out back here, use my second hand to hold the servo arm and push rod in place while I tighten the screw down. And there we go. Now, my servo should be installed to where my rudder and my nose wheel are now working correctly again. So you can see they're deflecting both directions. Right is right, left is left. It's important if you use the servo that we recommend, the reversing should be correct. Left and right should be operating as normal as they originally did. And then in this case, I've got the neutral positions kind of reset to where everything is centered mechanically, even when my trim is electronically centered. When I go to fly it, I may need to use some adjusting of the rudder trim here to make sure the airplane still tracks and flies perfectly straight. But basically, that is it. That is how you replace the rudder servo in particular. Similar method to replace the elevator servo if you ever need to. The servos that are mounted in the wings, they are glued into place. They're a little more difficult to remove and replace. It can be done, but that said, we do sell the replacement wing set with the servos already installed. Replacement fuselage comes with the servo installed, so if you do damage those components, it's a little bit easier to get back in the air quickly. But again, you can purchase most of the replacement parts separately, in this case the servo, to replace just the damaged servo.